Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Chair. I also join with my colleagues in thanking Senator Day for bringing this bill forward. And despite the admonishment just then from Senator McLucas about this not being the time or the place, the Greens have also from time to time introduced amendments that would radically change the course of a particular piece of legislation. I think today is as good a day as any. I'm not going to be supporting the amendment, and I'll explain as clearly as I can why not. Let's start with South Australia. I think where Senator Day and I would be in firm agreement is that the South Australian economy is in deep trouble. Between the closure of advanced manufacturing for cars, the extraordinary uncertainty that's faced by naval shipbuilders in South Australia at the moment, and, ironically enough, the uncertainty that's been provoked by BHP's intentions at the Roxby Downs expansion. Between those three things, you've got three of the larger employers, or I guess you could say potential employers, in the state of South Australia, all potentially hitting the wall at the same time. And I recognise, as do my South Australian colleagues, that puts the state in a very serious predicament, one that I would hope in here would be above politics. And it's without much pleasure that I'd remind Senator Day and others that it was only a week or so that 380 people, employees of BHP, lost their jobs. And I think part of that is as a consequence of the company's decision a couple of years ago now to not proceed with the expansion of the Roxby Downs open cut. Senator Day is quite right when he points out that Australia hosts a very large fraction of the world's uranium reserves, and actually the ore body at Olympic Dam operations or at the Roxby Downs site makes a surprisingly large proportion of that uranium inventory is at that one single site. The problem that we have that BHP discovered was that, yes, that deposit is huge, but it is very, very low grade, and it is a long way underground. BHP's initial modelling showed that they were going to need to run the largest haul packs in the world 24/7, around the clock, for 4 years just to remove the overburden, just before they could reach the top of the ore body, an excavation that would ultimately become the largest on the planet. 4 years worth of those diesel-powered monsters just going down into the pit, down and down and down, just to remove the overburden and put that in a temporary mountain to one side of the pit before you start milling marketable ore. And that, once we'd actually done the numbers on what the size of that open cut would look like and how much it would cost to access that ore body and how that would look and how much radioactive waste you would have piled on the surface within 50, 60, 70 years of the mine's life, because it really is that big, you are leaving in effect more than a cubic kilometre of very finely powdered, pulverised, carcinogenic radioactive waste on the surface. And neither the South Australian state government or the Commonwealth environmental regulators were proposing that that radioactive material should be put back in the hole at the end of mining. And that, I think, for one reason, one of the reasons that BHP ultimately decided not to proceed with the expansion, of which you could also argue that Roxby is effectively a copper-gold venture that has uranium as a byproduct, but one of the things that killed that expansion was, of course, the very low uranium price, the world uranium price that had fallen from that extraordinary spike in around 2007 to the point where they simply couldn't make the numbers add up. And now, even a couple of years after that decision's been made, you're still seeing the companies having to let people go. So yes, there is a lot of uranium, but it may actually be too big to mine. It's certainly too big to mine, too low grade and too deep to bring to the surface at this point in time. And that is before you bring into the issues that have plagued that site for many years: the destruction of Aboriginal country and sacred sites, in particular the draining of the Mound Springs, the extraordinary consumption of water in processing operations, not just for the uranium, but obviously for the copper, the gold, the other material that comes out of that underground site, and the fact that this is, of course, the feedstock for the global nuclear fuel chain. Senator Day used the term nuclear fuel cycle. This probably sounds a bit pedantic. I don't use that phrase. There is no cycle. There is no closed loop. It's never existed. It has been a dream since the 1950s that you could feed the waste products of the nuclear fuel cycle, as they were calling it then, in the form of plutonium, back into the front end at so-called breeder reactors. And nobody, not even the best engineers and technologists in the world, in Russia, in Japan, in North America, have ever figured out how to make it work. And when you were listing before, Senator Day, the countries that operate reprocessing plants, I'm presuming you would include Japan in that list. They're not reprocessing there at the moment. It is so formidably difficult to close the loop on the nuclear fuel cycle that we shouldn't dignify it with that term. It is a one-way process for creating very low-grade uranium ores into various categories of intractable, radioactive, carcinogenic waste, including here in this country. So no expansion at Roxby. And if you're looking to one of the world's largest uranium mines to provide those jobs and that economic stability in a time of great instability in other sectors, it is the last place that you would want to look. What about if we head north to a much higher grade deposit and look to Kakadu? The Ranger uranium mine presently is on its knees. The company has just abandoned proposals to go underground, looking at kind of the reverse process of what they're looking at Roxby. They won't be, according to Rio Tinto, going underground at Ranger, and so effectively you've got a mine that's on its knees, that they now have to have a very serious look at cleaning up 30 years of radioactive messes inside a World Heritage Area. And it's not at all clear from company statements as to whether they have the financial resources to do that. Coming back to Central South Australia, Beverley is buggered. The Beverley uranium mine is on its, that's probably a bit unparliamentary, is looking radically uneconomic. They have been shedding people as well. The Honeymoon mine that was opened with such fanfare a couple of years ago is uneconomic as well. It's not simply the low uranium price, but that is of course a key factor. Why is the world uranium price so low? Partly it is because of the indestructible optimism of advocates that we heard before from Senator Leyonhjelm, who put it about as well as I think I've heard it put in recent times, that glowing, radiating enthusiasm for an industry that simply derides any opposition as emotional or irrational and says we can finally kick the 1980s to one side. I thought it was very interesting, Senator Leyonhjelm, that was your baseline, because the 1980s was this curious collision of the hangover of 3 Mile Island, where the asset of a nuclear utility that had been running perfectly well was converted from an asset into a multi-billion-dollar liability over a period of about 20 minutes. And then at the point where regulators are trying to decide whether or not to evacuate 1 million people, from the site around the stricken reactor at 3 Mile Island, eventually they got that site back under control again, and no human being will ever set foot inside that reactor building again. But the markets, Wall Street in particular, had already decided that the industry was simply going to be uneconomic. The writing was on the wall before 1979, except that you had this huge construction build in the pipeline from the 60s and 70s. So the 1980s is a very interesting period to start looking at this industry, because you still had the tail end of that extraordinary construction boom of the 1970s and reactors coming online. It was a time of enormous optimism in the industry. Until 1986, where engineers at the Chernobyl plant in the Ukraine lost control of the reactor during a very, very poorly calibrated test and blew the site out of the building. Again, hundreds of thousands of people evacuated from that site, by which time the writing was very seriously on the wall. When I go to look for the facts, not for the stuff that I guess I was indirectly accused of by both of the previous speakers around irrationality, or it's just emotional, or you're not looking at the facts. I'll tell you where I get my facts, because they are available to everybody to evaluate. The World Nuclear Industry Status Report 2015, I think they've been in publication for 6 or 7 years now, and it's an extraordinarily valuable resource. If they don't bring an agenda, they wouldn't describe themselves, I would hope, as either pro or anti-nuclear, but they do put a lot of very important global data into the public domain, and they update it once a year, and that's why I guess I couldn't help myself, and I was a bit undisciplined during Senator Day's comments when he was putting stuff onto the public record that the evidence simply does not support. So let's go through some of this in a little bit of detail. One of the reasons that the world uranium price is so low is that inventories are piling up around the world. You had between 40 and 50 reactors in Japan offline, the entire country's nuclear fleet offline after 3 11, and nuclear inventory simply building up around the world. And the reason that they haven't started up again is because the Japanese public, first of all, they're aware that 160,000 radiation refugees had to be pulled out of that area. Most of them will never be able to go home. I don't know how many people have visited that site. I have. I got within 10 kilometres of the reactor into an area that had recently been opened up again, and it was though the tsunami had only just happened yesterday. It was a haunting experience. 150,000 radiation refugees still aren't able to go home, and nor is it likely that they will ever be able to. So the Japanese public that trusted the industry and were told that such a thing could never happen, there's been that staggering betrayal of trust. But the other thing that has happened is that people realised, and yes, it had an impact on Japanese coal and gas imports, but the Japanese public realised for the first time in the post-war era that they didn't need what they call the atomic mafia. The lights all stayed on. You know, the Japanese economy stayed intact, and yes, their energy imports went up. Instead of importing uranium from places like Australia, they're importing gas from places like Australia, but the lights stayed on. Two fundamental betrayals of trust. The industry wasn't needed and the industry wasn't safe. That has permanently changed the character of Japanese politics. And the other reason that, apart from, I think, one unit that went online within the last fortnight or so, the other reason that those reactors haven't started up in Japan is that local authorities, prefectural and district-level authorities, have a very important say in whether those plants get back up or not. If we're looking to Japan as a customer country for Australian uranium, we would need to look somewhere else. France was mentioned as a country with the highest density of installation of nuclear power stations in the world. It might have been Senator Leyonhjelm, I don't want to misquote you, who said that there had been no accidents. The record of accidents in the French nuclear industry, I'm not going to go into it in detail now, but it stands for itself. But here's the thing. The French authorities are backing out of the industry. Japan was once held up as the exemplar of the nuclear economy. We don't talk, so pro-nuclear advocates don't talk about Japan so much anymore, but they do talk about France. But Areva is now technically bankrupt. They were downgraded to junk status by Standard & Poor's. The share value has plunged to a new historic low on the 9th of July, a value loss of 90% since 2007. Areva is the state-owned entity that basically does everything in relation to atomic energy, all the way through the fuel chain, from mining to waste, parking and waiting and seeing. Areva is effectively bankrupt, and the French policy now is basically around getting from 70% back to less than 50% nuclear. They realise that extraordinary reliance on ageing and extremely inflexible and risky reactors in France is a dead end for their energy policy, and they're looking to diversify. Where are they looking? They're not looking to fossil. They're looking to clean energy, to renewable energy, and that's what's happening elsewhere. Nuclear plant construction starts. Again, this is from the World Nuclear Industry Status Report. The industry is stuffed, colleagues. The global nuclear industry is on its knees. It's on its way out. And this would be something of a tragedy, I would think, for well-meaning senators in here looking for economic diversification, looking for energy security, look to this dead end that has never, ever lived up to its promises. Nuclear plant construction starts plunged from 15 in 2010 to 3 in 2014. I'll just quote one paragraph from that same report. The 391 operating reactors are 47 fewer than the 2002 peak of 438. So peak nuclear was 2002. That's getting to be a while ago now. It has all been in decline since then, and there are 47 fewer reactors operating now than there were then. That's a reasonably large number. The total installed capacity peaked in 2010 at 368 gigawatts, before declining by 8% to 337 gigawatts. So now we've basically rewound the industry by about 20 years in terms of installed capacity. Annual nuclear energy generation reached 2,410 terawatt hours in 2014. That's a 2.2% increase over the previous year, but it's 9.4% down on the peak. So my question to Senator Day is whether you would like a copy of this document, and whether it is going to be possible to base this debate, which I do welcome, because the nuclear debate's been happening in Australia for decades, and there are important reasons why the pro-nuclear side keeps losing. And one of them, I would suspect, is simply overlooking the underlying fundamentals of a market that is broken and has delivered only risk despite promising such extraordinary benefits.